It's Sunday, August 24, 2025. I'm Anthony Davis. Welcome to the Weekend Show, where we make the time to consider the news of the week. You can support my work and independent journalism at patreon.com/5minutenews. Our guest today is a public defender whose book on the criminal court system and smarter public safety solutions, The Price of Mercy, is available for pre-order now. Emily Galvin Almanza, welcome back to the Weekend
Thank you
Show.
so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Now, Emily, since we last spoke, Donald Trump has flexed his authoritarian muscle once again by militarizing and federalizing the DC police under the false claim of reducing crime. We know that violent crime is actually down 30% in DC, but Trump's latest response to that is that the DC police have manipulated the data to make the crime rates lower. And he's now started an investigation into those figures. What's the real story here? Why is he putting armed National Guard on the streets in a mostly safe city and not even in high crime areas?
Yeah, we've all seen the footage of tanks lining the National Mall, right? The National Mall being one of the safest places you can be in DC. It's full of tourists and little kids admiring President Lincoln. I don't think that this has anything to do with crime. First of all, it's highly plausible that crime is down in DC because crime is down almost everywhere across the country. Crime had been declining for about 20 years by the time we got to the pandemic. And then in the wake of the pandemic, we saw a slight spike in crime. Now, that's completely reasonable. You coop people up with each other. You don't let them go outside. You create massive economic strain and uncertainty, cause people to become ill. In bad times, stress rises and crime rises with it. But since 2023, we've been watching crime fall. A lot of the really smart interventions that we've seen building since 2020, violence interruption programs, expanded access to mental health treatment, diversion programs, these are all kicking in. And so in DC, we saw a crime drop that was comparable to other major cities, about 26% since last year, 30% if you compare it to 2023. So the numbers aren't weird. The numbers make total sense. I obviously can't speak to what is going on internally with the DC Police Department, but I will say that it's generally not to the advantage of a police department to extremely fudge the numbers. In general, crime is job security for police.
Right,
so,
and funding as well, right?
And funding.
The more crime,
although they
the more
get funding both ways. They get to say, crime is down, we're doing a good job, give us more money, and then crime is up. You need us more, give us more money. But in general, if I were a police chief who was going to fudge anything, I would focus on clearance rates, which are the rates at which cases are closed, which is a much more important statistic that relates much more deeply to public safety. In terms of crime rates, those also don't just come from police. Those come from civilian complaints. That's data that's often tracked by the FBI. There's a lot of different ways one can get crime data that isn't just police reported. So to me, although I tend to smell fishy things everywhere, these crime numbers in DC don't seem super fishy to me. What seems fishy is a president who has already embraced unaccountable, masked, unidentifiable, violent law enforcement. People out in the streets, with the kind of cop clothes you can buy on Amazon, refusing to say what department they're from or who they are, violently assaulting and arresting people on the streets. So we have a president who embraces goon tactics and who also has publicly mused about his use of the military. The military is very expensive. It's just sitting there. It's not doing anything. Couldn't we do anything better with it? Well, now he's found a way to scratch his itch for military shows of force and to intimidate a city with democratic leadership, which is on balance doing pretty well on crime.
The irony is that he is a felon. And he's, claiming that, talking about criminals, the way he was referring to DC generally, he was calling it the most awful names. The people that live there, that I've seen talking about it, they have a very different experience and very different description. And some are actually saying that what he's doing on the streets of DC is actually going to make crime worse.
So there's really, it's interesting to think about. First of all, my experience echoes yours. I actually just had friends visiting me from DC, and things are fine. It's as safe as any major city. In fact, it's a lot safer than other major cities, some of which are in red states and are not on Trump's list of places he would like to take the military, places which tend to be notably in blue states and also disproportionately places with black leadership. But I will say, when we think about whether a law enforcement presence makes places safer, there are a lot of things one can do to create environmental conditions of safety. In general, having a place be observed is good. That could mean stationing an extra police officer on the block, but it takes a lot of police to lower crime by even one homicide. It takes about 17 extra officers to eliminate one homicide. If you do things like put in place more street lighting, planting trees, turning through streets into cul-de-sacs, upgrading dilapidated housing, turning empty lots into mini parks, all of these are tactics which can reduce crime much more dramatically than simply adding officers. The flip side of this coin is that exposure to violence actually makes people more likely to engage in harm. So when you're living in a city where the enforcement arm is throwing people around on the street or knocking delivery drivers off their bikes or doing really scary, violent things to the population and exposing people to violence, it's actually really bad for public safety. It can have the opposite of the intended effect. Also, increasing short-term jailing makes people more likely to experience crime in the future. If you put someone in jail for 2 days, they are more likely to be arrested again than someone who was never in jail. If you increase exposure to jail by like putting them in for a week, they're more likely than the 2-day person to get arrested again in the future. So these cycles of arrest and short-term jailing might feel like a safety factor to the layperson, but when we look at the data, it's actually making people more likely to engage in crime in the future.
And there is an emotional cost, not just for those people who are visiting DC, but people who live there. The idea that you live in what was formerly the free world. We have to be careful with our descriptions of the US these days, where you're enjoying all of the trappings that come with celebrating your freedoms as an American, and yet you're looking at tanks and you're looking at militarized police, federalized police, and now, because last week they were saying, well, they're not armed. The firearms are being held nearby, whatever that means. Now they're saying, well, actually, no, they are going to be armed now. I mean, what does that do for the emotions, for the psyche, for local people, as well as tourists and visitors?
Well, we're already seeing the impact on visitors. Interestingly, restaurant traffic in DC has declined precipitously as people choose not to go out, not to have a night out on the town.
It's about 35% down, I think.
It's a huge crash. 35% down is a massive dent in the bottom line of these restaurants. And restaurant margins are very, very thin. So this is a huge factor in whether these DC establishments are going to be able to survive a prolonged period of people not wanting to go outside. I mean, obviously, there is the incredibly emotionally high impact factor of walking out into your city, which is previously a beautiful, free, prosperous city, and now finding tanks lining the streets and armed military guards with, wandering around. Obviously, that's got an emotional impact. I will say also it's going to make traffic hell. All of these checkpoints, traffic hell. There's case law, which really calls into question whether these checkpoints are even legal or can continue. I'm expecting that to be litigated. But I also want to go back to, there is data on the effect of law enforcement contact on young children. And what we see in the research is that when you expose kids to negative contact with police, and remember, Trump has talked a lot about roving mobs of youngsters, and he seems really afraid of young people. So this enforcement is really directed at young people, particularly, I suspect, young people of color. What we see in the research is that when you criminalize a kid, when you approach them, question them, search them as if they've done something wrong, we see disengagement from education as fast as the next day. The next day at school, this kid is not paying attention, doesn't want to be there, might be checked out. We see long-term negative educational impact that is very clear in the research from contact between police and young people of exactly the kind we're seeing in DC.
You spoke for a moment about the kind of racial element to this. And I'd like to explore that a little bit, because we know that the cities that he has gone for so far, Los Angeles with Karen Bass, a black female mayor, and the same with DC, but certainly the other cities that he's talking about sending the military and the National Guard into also, ironically, have black leadership. There is a theme with so much of this. Now, a lot of it is baked into Project 2025. Those of us that have managed to get through that 900-page document recognize so much of these policies and these protocols that he's bringing about. This is not by accident, is it? That there is a concerted effort to make America white again, and this is just one of the ways of doing that.
It's really interesting, especially that he name-checked Mayor Scott of Baltimore. Now, the reason I say it's interesting is, if he wanted a factual basis to argue that any city in America is experiencing a big crime problem caused by a failure of local governance, right? Because crucially, there's got to be two factors here for him to claim there's some kind of emergency. One, that there's an actual crime emergency, which, again, there's not in DC. And two, that local government is incapable of doing anything for itself and therefore requires this kind of intervention. Mayor Scott has recently been praised to the high heavens, and deservedly so, for investing really intelligently in data-based strategies that lower crime. In particular, Mayor Scott has invested in community violence interruption. And the way that works is a lot of gun violence is people making bad choices in the moment when they're really mad at somebody else. I mean, you don't have to be a researcher to know that. That's just a human thing, but it also bears out in the research. And what community violence interrupters do is recognize that in some places, people do not trust the police. The police coming in is going to make things worse. But a trusted member of the community who knows who's fighting with whom, what's happening around the neighborhood, can intervene in disputes before they become too heated, and can begin to resolve situations and convince people not to engage in violence. It's extraordinarily effective, so much so that under the Biden administration, this was a whole sector of safety work that was largely funded by the federal government. Now, community violence interruption and, interestingly, victim services were two things that Trump focused on cutting almost immediately in his tenure when it came to federal funding. But Mayor Scott invested in them, and he kept community violence interruption going in Baltimore. And the result has been a really notable drop in crime in Baltimore. So to pick on Mayor Scott really doesn't feel like it could be about anything other than personal or racial animosity.
3 more Republican governors have authorized deployment of National Guard troops to Washington, D.C. Mississippi, Tennessee, Louisiana. It's now brought the number of state troops detailed to the president's effort to more than 1,100, and the number of states to 6. This is being extended. Could you just explain the law on this? Because I thought he only had 30 days with which to exercise this militarized effort. He's now seeking to extend that potentially indefinitely. I mean, they say until crime comes down. What is the... I know it's being fought by Democrats, and legal cases have been mounted to try and reverse all of this, but he doesn't really care for the judiciary or even for the law in this case.
Indeed. There's it's a complicated question that I'm going to try to break into a few different chunks. Thing number one is Trump has talked about not just doing this in DC, but as you mentioned, name checking all of these other cities where he would like to replicate his authoritarian tactics. Now, in those cities, it is very difficult for the federal government to intervene in the way he wants to because of exactly what you described. There's not a lot of leeway to declare a perpetual emergency. And perpetual emergency is what we're talking about here, because Trump wants to stay with troops in DC until crime goes down, but we don't trust any of the crime numbers. So how will we ever know if Trump's crime goes down? I guess he'll have to tell us, since the numbers aren't real. So this is actually a great example of litigation on this, is Newsom versus Trump, a case that's playing out right now in California, which has to do with Trump's deployment. It's a very similar deployment of the National Guard to Los Angeles. Like 6 people waved some flags and stood on cars in LA. Trump calls it an emergency, sends in the National Guard. But Gavin Newsom, who has been, of course, one of the most vehement and vocal opponents of this administration and tactics like this, has taken him to court. It's going to be exciting to see how that plays out. But in addition, DC is suffering from playing under like really different rules of the game because DC is not a state. The states can litigate these emergency declarations because they have a certain level of sovereignty afforded to them by our system of government. DC is in a very strange limbo where all they have is the Home Rule Act, a 1970s law which intended to define certain freedoms held by the District of Columbia versus interventions that the federal government can make. This too will be litigated. So I don't want to pretend that anything Trump has declared is actually what's going to play out, because he has this tendency of declaring things that are patently illegal and trying to do them and then needing to be reined back in by the courts. So I do think we're going to see litigation over what's happening in DC. But if people are concerned about what an administration can do to the District of Columbia and how much other states can bully this small city on the East Coast, we should all be concerned about DC statehood. And that's why, in part, this is the issue of DC statehood is such a big issue. There are many other reasons why DC statehood is an issue, but not allowing DC to be run around like this and letting them have true sovereignty and true representation. Don't their license plates still say taxation without representation?
I think so.
I mean, that's what they've got.
Yeah. There is a pattern forming where Donald Trump claims that there is an invasion, whether it be an invasion of crime, an invasion of drug dealers or gang members from Venezuela or goodness knows where, because he has worked out that he can kind of get around the law by using these caveats for the war powers or however they're described. Could you just talk to that for a moment? Because my fear is that what we're heading towards is him taking advantage of that rule when it comes to elections, suspending elections potentially. I mean, he got very excited with Volodymyr Zelensky in the Oval Office this last week, where he kind of said, oh, well, you're not having any elections because, supposedly you've got a war on. Well, they'd be very unhappy with me if I said that, wink, wink. But of course that's what he's thinking because he says this stuff out loud. So how do we move forward when we have a commander-in-chief who is faking invasions in order to apply his unique brand of authoritarianism?
So I think the first thing that has really disheartened me is that in all of these claims of invasions, it has ultimately come out that these claims were based on total lies. I mean, when we look at the 200 people who were extraordinarily rendered to a torture prison in El Salvador under claims that these were violent, dangerous gang members, worst of the worst. And they turned out to be like a guy with an autism awareness tattoo and a gay hairdresser. I mean, we've been shown that we cannot trust the claims of this administration. At best, their practices are disinterested in factual accuracy and extremely sloppy as they move way too fast. At worst, it's an administration that is absolutely willing to engage in falsehoods and communicate falsehoods to the public in order to get away with the authoritarian power grabs that they'd like to get away with. I don't know that enough people are paying attention and tracking the lies and building that into their reality framework of how they understand the messaging that comes out of this administration.
And even Tom Homan has lied about conditions over and over, and no one is really holding the administration's feet to the fire over this. We're really hearing this stuff through back channels, aren't we?
Absolutely. I mean, I hope that if there is a shift in power in the legislature during the midterms, we're going to be seeing people hauled before Congress under subpoena to testify about why they're misleading the public and what's really going on. I mean, I believe that the American public absolutely deserves more truth than they are getting right now. However, before we get to that, I will say, I'm not as worried as you are about suspension of elections. I'm much more worried about something more insidious and subtle. I'm concerned about a combination of gerrymandering and voter intimidation that lowers turnout and constrains the freedom to vote in ways that are much less obvious than suspending elections. For example, if I were Trump, I would not want to make the big show of not having an election. I would want gerrymandered districts where I have a very high likelihood of the Republicans succeeding. And I would also want to choke out voting in neighborhoods I knew weren't going to support me. Now, we saw a lot of this actually in the last election, and we've seen it across the country in instances where Democrats have thought a lot about getting out the vote, but they haven't given enough thought to the infrastructure needed to vote. I remember a friend telling me about an election in Florida where a young Democratic challenger lost by a handful of votes, something under 200 votes, in a district where there had been historic turnout at the local university, but the local university had only had 4 voting booths. So students were lined up in like 14-hour lines that no one could sustainably get through and also live their lives. And therefore their vote was suppressed. And we had the turnout, but we didn't have the infrastructure. And so to me, that form of voter suppression, combined with the gerrymandering that we're seeing in Texas, I mean, Texas, where they've literally put their Democratic lawmakers under lock and key to get away with the gerrymandering effort they have underway, that's a way for Trump to try to secure a victory that is not actually a free and fair electoral victory, but that he can claim is one.
I don't know if you feel as I do, and it's quite politically incorrect to say it out loud, but the more I hear about Donald Trump's antics regarding corruption with elections, the less I feel that he legitimately won back in November. Do you know what I mean? Because it's almost adding credence to all of the arguments that I think Democrats were frightened to say out loud. And this all goes back to the fact that Trump is the one that claims that there is some kind of, the vote was rigged for the reason that he didn't win in 2020. And consequently, that meant that Democrats didn't want to use that language because they didn't want to kind of drop to his level. Mm-hmm. But you can't deny the reality. We know about voter suppression in 2024. We also know about the investment from the likes of Elon Musk. So, stuff has been going on. Do you think it's important for Democrats to be less frightened about this kind of political correctness of not calling out election interference when it is clearly happening?
Yeah, I do think the Democrats generally need to be a lot less concerned with propriety overall and a lot less concerned with the way things are historically done. We had this government. This is one of our big, horrible realizations of the last 8 months, which is that our government was in fact not made of laws. It was largely made of traditions and practices and propriety and deference and professionalism. And all of these are things that a person can choose to throw out the window or light on fire. And Democrats are very reluctant to ever throw those things out the window or light them on fire. But we're in a moment now where we're kind of showing up to gunfights with a banana. And I think that doesn't mean that Democrats need to get out there making, equally flimsy claims of electoral interference. But it does mean that we have to not be afraid to say, for example, if and when Donald Trump says, we need new voting machines and I, Donald Trump, want to be the one certifying the new voting machines. We need to be ready to take that to the people and say, no, all of us as a nation need to have independently, verifiably secure voting infrastructure that cannot be in the hands of one party or another. There needs to be a neutral authority who cannot be bought, who doesn't work for Elon Musk, a neutral authority with no government contracts. That can verify our electoral security. I also think that there's a way for Democrats to muddle through this that doesn't involve sounding pants on head crazy the way they might perceive the other side sometimes does. And that's to say, we hear your concerns about past elections. Let's put together a bipartisan independent commission. Let's make sure that all of our machines are independently, verifiably secure. I also think that Democrats need to really get out ahead of the game in terms of the mutterings coming from the White House right now on mail-in voting and other, suppressive tactics we can expect this administration to take. You better believe that people from inside the Trump administration are contacting county officials right now to try to make sure there's too many voting machines in the red neighborhoods and too few voting machines in the blue neighborhoods. I'm just speculating. I don't know that. I just think it's a fair speculation. But I think that if the Democratic Party wants to try to enforce any form of fair play, they also need to be getting out ahead of the game in local counties and talking to the right officials to make sure there's going to be the right number of machines for the right number of people in all of the places. Finally, I'll say it's really depressing to me that we're in a moment where the only hope of a legislature remaining balanced across parties is gerrymandering on both sides. It's unbelievably depressing. The fact that a lot of blue states have gone to the lengths of creating fair independent commissions to create fair maps that they might now have to give up because the Republican states have chosen not to play fair. It's a really dark time. It's a dark moment. I understand, again, that Democrats have to take the steps they have to take to not show up to a gunfight with a banana, but it's not great for democracy.
We have to take a quick break, but I want to come back and talk about Gavin Newsom's response to Texas's gerrymandering. And also to Donald Trump's announcement this week that he has his lawyers working on an executive order to ban mail-in voting. We'll do that next on The Weekend Show. When you start a podcast, it seems like you have to figure it out all by yourself. Scripts, setup, filming schedule, logos. It can be super overwhelming, and every day seems to introduce a new decision that needs an answer. When you're starting off with something new, it seems like your to-do list keeps growing every day with new tasks, and that list can start to begin to overrun your life. So finding the right tool that not only helps you out, but simplifies everything can be such a game changer. And for millions of businesses, that tool is Shopify. Shopify is the e-commerce platform behind millions of businesses around the world, and 10% of all e-commerce in the US, from household names like Mattel and Gymshark to brands just getting started. You can get started with your own design studio with hundreds of ready-to-use templates. Shopify helps you build a beautiful online store to match your brand's style. Accelerate your content creation. Shopify is packed with helpful AI tools that write product descriptions, page headlines, and even enhance your product photography. Get the word out like you have a marketing team behind you. Easily create email and social media campaigns wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling. And best yet, Shopify is your commerce expert with world-class expertise in everything from managing inventory to international shipping to processing returns and beyond. If you're ready to sell, you're ready for Shopify. Turn your big business idea into with Shopify on your side. Sign up for your $1 per month trial and start selling today at shopify.com/weekend. Go to shopify.com/weekend. Shopify.com/weekend. Did you know that over 1/3 of Americans, that's roughly 36%, have below average credit scores, which can make borrowing more difficult and expensive? And roughly a quarter haven't checked their credit score in the past year. And 1 in 6 of those don't know how to. Did you know that drivers with poor credit pay 118% more for full coverage auto insurance compared to drivers with excellent credit? Well, this is where Kickoff comes in. Users with credit under 600 grew an average of 84 points in their first year with one-time payments. With transparent, affordable plans starting at just $5 a month with no hidden fees and zero interest, Kickoff helps you score big when it comes to credit. It's simple. You make on-time payments, credit bureaus see good behavior, and your credit can grow fast. Start building credit immediately for only $1 for your first month. AutoPay helps you build credit while you sleep and never worry about missing a payment. Sign up in minutes from your phone, no credit check, and cancel anytime. With over 1 million users and hundreds of thousands of positive reviews, there's a reason why Kickoff is the #1 credit builder on the App Store. Start building credit with Kickoff today, and you can get your first month for as little as $1. That's 80% off the usual price when you go to getkickoff.com/weekendshow today. That's kickoff without the C. Get kickoff.com/weekend show. We're back on the Weekend Show with Emily Galvin Almanza. I'm Anthony Davis. So Donald Trump has announced in quite a fanfare, actually, he did it in front of Vladimir Zelensky, that he'd kind of taken advice from Vladimir Putin, that mail-in ballots are, really unfair way of voting and dangerous for democracy. I mean, you can imagine Putin saying this stuff to Trump, and Trump totally kind of buying it. It's another conversation about Putin manipulating the US election, but certainly when it comes to this president here, we know traditionally that Democrats are more likely to vote by mail and Republicans less so. Is that what this is all about? This is effectively election interference, isn't it? This is voter suppression by trying to change the rules of the game.
Yeah, growing up, I spent some time working with cattle. And when you're trying to get cattle into a chute, you have riders surrounding them on all sides and pushing them towards this narrow opening that then they're going to go into, and it's going to route them into whatever situation you want them to be in, whether it's putting them in a trailer or clamping them in a spot to give them a vaccine, whatever it's going to be. To me, what this is Vladimir Putin trying to get Trump to cut off any avenue for the cattle to get out of the chute. What the chute is here is routing us into that election interference landscape where there's not enough voting machines in the Democratic neighborhoods and people are standing in line for the entire day without. Remember, they've tried to pass laws that you couldn't hand out water or food in these lines too. Like, these are all ways of trying to cut off any mechanism the cattle have to get out of the voter suppression chute. Mail-in voting is the best way out of that chute, because mail-in voting is something people can do on their own time in a way that is feasible for them. It doesn't involve standing in line for hours. They also get more space to think about the issues. When you get your voter booklet and it's full of other issues besides the legislature or the presidency, propositions and interesting local laws that you might want to think about, mail-in voting is great because people can, in the quiet of their home, really consider their choices. So if you want people to not be able to vote or be disheartened out of voting or be trapped in a line with no water until they give up, you have to go after mail-in voting. But may I just say that the fact that the American president at this point thinks it is a palatable message to the American people to say, hey, I'm doing this thing that relates to your right and ability to vote because the Russian guy told me to, is mind-blowing. Where we are as a people, where his voters can say, yeah, I'm really glad he's taking advice and following what Vladimir Putin tells him to do. That is quite some mental gymnastics from where we were even 5 years ago.
He also lied and said that the US was the only country that did mail-in voting. I mean, that in itself is not just such a kind of blatant lie, but it also insults the intelligence of people, not just in the US, but around the world, who believe in democracy. I mean, there are 40 countries that have full, mail-in voting, and there's another 100 countries that have some form of mail-in voting. It is arguably the safest way of voting, where there's going to be less voter intimidation. I mean, they send these goons to stand outside polling places now to intimidate people and harass them about their vote. I mean, that's not going to happen at home, unless, of course, you're a trad wife in a conservative household, which we're now hearing about also, where the men are insisting that the women vote for Donald Trump. But how do you feel about this argument too, that the US is the only country that does it? Trying to talk about mail-in voting like it is, subject to problems that actually don't exist.
I mean, how do you feel about any argument that's based on a total falsehood? If I say to you that the sky is blood red and I make an argument based on that about how it's not safe to fly in planes right now because the sky is blood red, you can't really take my airplane argument too seriously because the sky is discernibly not red.
But Trump is doing that on multiple subjects. I mean, it's not just voting. This is part of his mental illness. This is part of his kind of clinical narcissistic personality disorder. This is part of his egomania. That he will tell you that the sky is red, and as he sees it, if you don't think it's red, then there's something wrong with you, not him. And that is a pox that seems to be spreading amongst not just his supporters, but there is a fear. My fear certainly is this hyper-normalization of these factual inaccuracies, where the media just lets them go.
Well, no, the media, I think, has not done enough, perhaps, but has certainly fact-checked the lies. What I've seen more that concerns me is, I was talking to a friend. As you know, I talk to people who vehemently disagree with me on things because I think that's healthy and deeply American.
And brave as well, very brave.
I've known these people for years. We can have fights with each other and still really like each other's kids. It's all good. But I remember, do you remember when Trump was claiming that there were immigrants who were eating cats and dogs? Remember, they're eating the cats, they're eating the dogs. Yes. I was talking to someone about this because to me it was so visibly, obviously implausible and such a ridiculous way of creating fear against the immigrant community. And this person found for me this video, which was a video that someone had shot on their cell phone of a police encounter with a woman who appeared to be seriously mentally ill. And another woman in the video was saying, she ate this dog. She's So to me as a criminal defense attorney, I'm like, okay, we have an accusation. We don't have any evidence. We have no dog in the frame, no indications of anyone having eaten anything. There's literally no evidence here. There's just one person accusing another on the street. So to me, that's not very convincing evidence that this thing actually took place. And yet that video with one accusation, which to my knowledge was never substantiated, I never saw a substantiation of this, was enough for this person to believe the president when he started claiming they're eating the cats and they're eating the dogs. And so that's what's more concerning to me is no matter how many times the media says that was a lie, no one was eating cats and dogs. We've reached a situation where a quarter of the population, because remember, more people didn't vote than voted for Donald Trump. About a quarter of the population will discount anything the media tells them because the mainstream media has been undermined as a source of credibility. They don't hang out with journalists like I do and know how rigorously those journalists are fact-checking their stories and trying to find cracks in what these people are telling them and really, really the work that's being done to bring the citizenry the truth. And instead, they'll find this grain of truth video, right, which doesn't actually prove the point, but which gives them something that feels like substantiation. And the fact that at this point, our informational literacy has crumbled to a degree where a mere accusation on a video that to me is not evidence can be treated as evidence and internalized by somebody else and used to further their belief when Donald Trump then says, we're the only country in the world with mail-in voting.
Right. It's like positive reinforcement, though, isn't it? People almost seeking the narrative that delights them the most or connects with them the most.
Yes.
And there's so much content out there now that, you go looking for it. It's a bit like, finding quack doctors to say that mRNA vaccines are bad. I mean, you can find there is someone representing every opinion. And if they're wearing a white coat and a stethoscope, then people are inclined to believe them, especially on an Instagram reel.
Absolutely. I mean, the other thing about it that's so disconcerting to me is that it renders people able to take each other's freedoms away. And these could be people who are very pro-freedom as a concept.
Right.
But the second you say, hey, I'm going to give you this little grain of truth, and then you can take the freedom away from all of these immigrants who you've never met. Or you say, living in DC is different than living in the countryside in the middle of the country. There is more crime in DC than there is in a town of 200 people somewhere in the Midwest. Yeah. And these people are ready to say, well, then crush the citizenry of DC. I don't care that they don't want this intervention. Foist it upon them. They have to take it because I want their city to look more like mine and I deserve to decide for them. That's a new, I guess it's not new, but it's a grotesque bridge that we're seeing people walk more and more.
The grotesque is a good word because, and you alluded to it just before the break, the idea of, they go low, we go lower. Mm-hmm. And I'm referring to Democrats in California, Republicans in Texas, attempting to redraw the voting lines for the midterm congressional elections next year. It's a break from the usual process. And, Trump asked Texas to find 5 more seats, right? I mean, it was a very blatant form of rigging an election. And I'm pleased to see that some senior Democrats are actually using that language now. Trump is trying to rig the midterms. And that is, very helpful in this moment. A bit like the media finally saying the word lies as opposed to falsehoods. I mean, that's taken like 5 years. So what is your feeling? You mentioned Gavin Newsom. I mean, what is your feeling about Democrats going low to meet this moment, especially when it comes to redistricting and gerrymandering, things that people don't fully understand, and therefore it seems like lawmakers can take advantage of these situations?
I'm going to push back against the idea that Gavin Newsom is going low, and I have a reasoned argument for this. The Texas legislature is doing something that is within their power to do because they never had the good democratic bona fides to create an independent districting commission. Texas has never tried to engage in the level of fair play that is constitutionally enshrined in California. Texas plays it fast and loose. And so they're once again playing it fast and loose. They're locking lawmakers up inside the Capitol. They're put everybody else on house arrest, and they're following them around with law enforcement because they are going to do something that is so completely counter-democratic that they've given themselves the freedom to do. Now, in California, lawmakers have not given themselves the freedom to do that. And what Gavin Newsom is doing is actually something that is nowhere near as low as what's happening in Texas. And here's why. Gavin Newsom is not making a unilateral decision to redistrict his state. And his legislature is also not making a unilateral decision to redistrict the state. They've redrawn maps, and you know what they're doing? They're putting it to the people. They're putting it to the people of California to decide whether they would like to temporarily, and that's crucial, because California doesn't want to be gerrymandered forever, temporarily change the maps in order to counterbalance the fact that democracy is gone in Texas. And I think the fact that he's putting it to the people is really powerful. I mean, obviously, like, his Twitter is fire, and he's doing a lot of things that are exciting in terms of, for those of us who've been wanting to see Democratic leadership take off the gloves.
Yeah, finally.
But ultimately, he's not actually doing the anti-democratic thing in an anti-democratic way. He's doing it in the most democratic way possible, which is a referendum on the ballot in November.
So interesting to me how the Republicans see the Democrats as the baddies and the Democrats see the Republicans as the baddies. And, the reality here, as you clearly describe, is you have to think critically and look at the detail and have access to correct information to realize that in this game between Newsom and Greg Abbott, there really is only one goodie and one baddie. And that, is it as clean cut as that? Or do you think that there are some gray areas here?
I don't get it. I mean, look at it this way. I'm really excited. I don't know if you have gotten your bag of popcorn ready for the Epstein subpoena that's coming to the House Oversight Committee. But that was a bipartisan effort. Representative Massey joined Ro Khanna in bringing this subpoena because the American people deserve to know whether something is being concealed about people in power on both sides. There may be Democrats.
Republicans have an ulterior motive in that, though, don't they? Because they're hoping that people like Bill Clinton will be hauled over the coals, and so that's their incentive.
Sure.
And Democrats are hoping that Donald Trump's name is going to appear. So
sure, although Massey's gone against his party on this. I mean, most Republicans seem to want to pretend that the Epstein files, just darn a thing, don't exist, don't look over here. There's nothing under this large blanket I've placed. Yeah. But what my point is that the whole problem right now is deciding who is or is not the baddies.
Yeah.
And I think that if Democrats locked up Republican lawmakers in the legislature to force them to be present for a vote that was going to strip them of representation completely in their state, I would be against that too. And a lot of people would be against that too. I mean, the American people aren't stupid. I think they've been subjected to a lot of really bad misinformation. But at the end of the day, we should be able to see that, like, there's a difference between putting something to the people and locking up your fellow lawmakers until they comply.
Just finally on voter suppression, Florida is among 11 Republican-dominated legislatures that have impinged on ways that the electorate can register to vote. This is just registering. There's not even going to the polling place, whilst also redistricting voter registration drives there. A report says DeSantis has given partisan actors unprecedented authority over elections. He's also created election police to investigate and prosecute supposed fraud and intimidate eligible voters. So we're dealing with voter suppression, subversion, disenfranchisement, gerrymandering, radical redistricting. These are the tools used to subvert the will of the people, particularly African Americans, from their constitutional right to vote. How much more noise can we be making about this stuff?
I mean, not just African Americans. Can we talk about Latinos in Florida?
Right.
I mean, most of the, like, when you look at what prosecutions for voter fraud actually look like, there's a lot of mistakes out there. There's like the person who like registered in the wrong district, and like, or the person who like thought they were allowed to vote because they'd finished probation, but they actually aren't allowed to vote for like another 2 years. There's a lot of just like people who messed up that can either be treated as people who messed up and told, hey, you can't vote, don't do that again, here's a fine, or they can be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law and even intimidated with our new practice of scaring the hell out of even naturalized citizens. So when there are Latino people who are citizens of this country who are currently living in fear of wrongful deportation, rendition, disappearance, and then you compound that with this idea that if you mess up on your election forms, you could have the election police coming after you. I mean, it is a state of fearful oppression that most people cannot withstand. So, I mean, you got to ask yourself, if one side has to engage in tactics of such violence and fear to try to win, how will that side survive long term? Because long term, I mean, Democrats need to get out in front of this now, as I said, thinking about not just getting out the vote, but getting out the infrastructure to protect people to vote and working through the suppression to help people safely register and feel confident that they're doing it all right. But we also need to be confident that a political perspective that requires this much violence to survive will not survive forever. And whether it survives for a long time or just for another short while is really up to how Democrats respond in this moment. And not just Democrats, but anyone who is pro-equal representation, pro-personal freedom, pro-American prosperity and our actual constitutional values outside of the Second Amendment. So anyone, regardless of ideology, who believes in those things and wants us to live in a free and fair country, if they take significant enough action right now, we can shorten the throes of this authoritarian nightmare.
What I'm seeing, though, are people who don't just support Trump, but have been, who have some, systemic racism is baked into their DNA for one reason or another. And they're actually getting off on a lot of this stuff and getting off on the deportations. And the way that it's marketed by, Kristi Noem. I was in a thrift store the other day and I heard on a radio station that was playing, an iHeart radio station, Kristi Noem in a 30-second commercial that apparently is playing all the time, because I asked, how often does this come on? It's on all the time. Do not come here. You are not welcome. You will be taken away. You will be removed. This evil language where this cruelty. And my concern is that there are an increasing number of people who are buying into that cruelty. They're like, finally, this is happening. Finally, the brown people are being sent away. I covered a story last week, Emily, that I didn't really see covered anywhere else, saying that ICE were deporting migrants from the U.S. mainland to a prison in Hawaii taking some from Florida on a 10-hour flight out to the Pacific Islands. I mean, it's nuts. I mean, just in terms of cost and waste. But the cruelty is the point, isn't it?
It is. They see cruelty as a deterrent to migration. It is a tactic. Yeah. It is a deliberate tactic. And, there might have been a time when I would have argued that amongst ordinary people, that level of, that embrace of cruelty and isolationism is rare, and that we're seeing it really on display in these sort of very TV hungry administration leadership people who are just cosplaying, fascist Barbie. But as I watch, ICE enforcement in the streets, look, I'm a longtime criminal defense attorney. I don't usually lionize police, but I will say that I've met a lot of police officers who joined the force because they wanted to keep their neighborhood safe and they wanted to be a force for good. Obviously, the structure of policing can make that really, really hard to do. But I don't necessarily see people who've joined ICE as an agency because they want everyone to feel safe in America. I've seen outreach to people who already want to hurt others with an enticement that they can be paid to do so. I've seen structures and incentives that are built to promote misbehavior. Anytime you create a system with no accountability, like not just you can't be sued, but you can't even be identified, you are fostering bad behavior. Lack of accountability fosters bad behavior. When you create a workplace where violence is an acceptable tactic, and there will be no accountability, nor will there even be sufficient identification that there could be social consequences for your actions on the job. We're removing all societal mechanisms by which we as a society establish norms of acceptable behavior. You are creating a workplace environment that is built for abuse. And to see my fellow Americans enthusiastically joining that force, it's deeply troubling to me. ICE has always had a really hard time hiring because most people don't want to do those jobs and be part of that culture. And so now I have to ask myself, who have they decided to accept and who have they chosen to attract?
Well, there's a $50,000 sign-up bonus in some cases, and there's commission for the number of people you arrest. And we've now heard through witness testimony of people saying, I heard them laughing and saying, oh, how many did you get today? And then there was a video the other day, I don't know if you saw it, of these ICE guys in a truck who shouted some kind of detrimental language about, oh, you liberals. And it made me think, our worst fears are that the people that are taking these jobs are white supremacists. They're Proud Boys and Oath Keepers, bringing their own costumes in some cases, and that there is a kind of racist element to this, because it seems unbelievable to me that anybody with a good heart and a sense of humanity would be able to do some of these disappearings and abductions that we've seen. And sometimes we have to trust our instinct and know that actually that is what's happening. I mean, Trump has fired a whole bunch of people from the federal government. You have to ask, where are people going to find work? And it seems that the only work that is on offer is rounding up the brown people and disappearing them.
Well, also, I mean, I was watching that video that you described with a friend who has worked in government, for whom, to ever do their job while being like, this is for liberals or this is for conservative, to mention partisanship while carrying out government activity is like an absolute no-go. Again, as of last year, our government was supposed to represent everybody. And our government was supposed to be a place free from partisan bullying so that anyone, regardless of ideology, could feel safe interacting with our government. And to have a government employee blatantly just declaring a side is such a departure from any form of governmental professionalism. It's just a reminder that that was a norm. Our government was built on norms. There should have been laws.
This is this is in America's historical timeline. I mean, people will be talking and writing about this period for decades to come, and we're living through this now, and everybody, certainly that I know, is feeling it. I mean, I was with some parents outside the school, and they were like, "How are you feeling about everything?" They didn't even need to say what. Like, we all knew mutually. Like,
you can't write like, "I hope this email finds you well" anymore. Like, say, "How are you doing?" It's like, "How are you doing under these circumstances?"
Right.
Yeah.
And this is what it feels like to live under an authoritarian dictatorship. Like, we've gone past the constitutional crisis. I mean, that was about 4 months ago, when the plane should have turned around and come back, and it didn't. It kept going. I mean, that was the point that changed. But now we're in a whole new place. I'm going to ask you, we're going to take another break, but I want to ask you something quite harrowing and serious about the real reason that all of these policies are kind of rushing in at once, about eradicating, certain people from the US and the tactics taken with which to do it. We'll do that next on The Weekend Show. When you start a podcast, it seems like you have to figure it out all by yourself. Scripts, setup, filming schedule, logos. It can be super overwhelming, and every day seems to introduce a new decision that needs an answer. When you're starting off with something new, it seems like your to-do list keeps growing every day with new tasks, and that list can start to begin to overrun your life. So finding the right tool that not only helps you out, but simplifies everything can be such a game changer. And for millions of businesses, that tool is Shopify. Shopify is the e-commerce platform behind millions of businesses around the world, and 10% of all e-commerce in the US, from household names like Mattel and Gymshark to brands just getting started. You can get started with your own design studio with hundreds of ready-to-use templates. Shopify helps you build a beautiful online store to match your brand's style. Accelerate your content creation. Shopify is packed with helpful AI tools that write product descriptions, page headlines, and even enhance your product photography. Get the word out like you have a marketing team behind you. Easily create email and social media campaigns wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling. And best yet, Shopify is your commerce expert with world-class expertise in everything from managing inventory to international shipping to processing returns and beyond. If you're ready to sell, you're ready for Shopify. Turn your big business idea into with Shopify on your side. Sign up for your $1 per month trial and start selling today at shopify.com/weekend. Go to shopify.com/weekend. Shopify.com/weekend. We're back with Emily Galvin Almanza on The Weekend Show. I'm Anthony Davis. Just before the break, I alluded to this theory that I'm starting to look at very seriously, that Trump is not just seeking to deport people, but remove people from existence. And this is where the dictatorship and this authoritarianism really starts to bite, because as I understand it, or as I see it, that he would actually rather people were dead. I mean, would rather than deport them, which is expensive, just kill them. I mean, that would be the ideal. But, with working within the framework of the law, he kind of has to operate as he currently is. But I'm sure that his intentions are far more violent and dangerous. And this is a pattern with authoritarians in history. So it's nothing new. And the reason I bring this up is I was reading a study that was published last month in the medical journal The Lancet that estimated that USAID programs have saved over 90 million lives over the past 2 decades. But the researchers also estimated that if current cuts continue through 2030, 14 million people who might have otherwise lived could die. Well, Hitler is estimated at killing 12 million people during the Second World War. Donald Trump has shut down the United States Agency for International Development cancelled 83% of the programs, and ultimately has the potential blood of 14 million people on his hands. Does that not suggest it's different, obviously, to the way that the Nazi regime operated? But in terms of the modern day, having learned from history, is this not a kind of stealth-like way simply to eradicate people of colour and really trailblaze this white America that he really wants?
I don't know if you could attribute that level of intentionality to it when we see a disregard for human life that reaches far beyond the examples that you've just given. I mean, certainly I think that there is a disregard for the concerns of marginalized people that exceeds the lack of concern for marginalized white people. But, you know, what I'm thinking of in particular is the cuts to our health infrastructure that ended cancer research that was really, really promising. There's an mRNA cancer vaccine that could have fixed pancreatic cancer, for example, right, which kills thousands of people. You know, ending vaccine development, vaccines that could have saved millions of lives. Cutting off research that could have been transformative for our children. You know, cutting the National Weather Service so that we're no longer as likely to get accurate warnings when a dangerous storm is coming. And then also cuts to public broadcasting, which reduce our ability to receive early alerts that could let us evade the extreme weather that we may not have been warned timely about. It's like there's so many things that this administration has done that evince to me a disregard for human life. I think there are certainly individuals within the administration who harbor the kind of views you're talking about. But as I understand it, the position of this administration generally is a little bit what we heard from Joni Ernst in Iowa. Just like what she said was everybody's going to die. But what I hear from this administration is y'all are going to die.
Yes. But is this not the modern equivalent of firing squads? I just think that, you know, obviously we've evolved to a point that we understand what is barbaric. Mm-hmm. And, you know, so people recognize, hopefully most people recognize that the Holocaust was barbaric. So, but that doesn't change the intentions of evil dictators. And, you know, Trump has really evolved into this person now that the guardrails have gone and now that the John Kellys and the James Mattises are not around to hold him back. In fact, he's actively encouraged to behave like this. And even just the cuts to Medicare through his bill are ultimately going to kill potentially millions of people over the next few decades.
And I mean, and more if you consider the fact that Medicare expansion dropped crime by up to 26%, and we're going to see an accordant rise in crime when we cut Medicare back. The reason I'm hesitating is that, to me, it's very important that we differentiate between affirmative killing by the government and passive killing by the government. Because, you know, there is a difference to me between the passive killing of Medicaid and USAID cuts and the active violent attack of sending a completely innocent person to CICOT in El Salvador, possibly to die there. Or the active killing of a political enemy, which we have not yet seen in this country. And I want to be really clear that, like, that is another step. That is another step that remains ahead of us. Yet the passive killing of putting someone in immigration detention and not giving them medicine so that they die of a communicable disease they catch there, or not giving them food, or keeping them in conditions that are non-survivable. Yes. So I don't want to draw an equivalency, because I think that, I mean, as someone who works in the criminal justice system, the criminal legal system, where our government does affirmatively kill people and has killed innocent people, not because they were political dissidents at this point, but certainly for political reasons, because tough on crime is a political perspective. And there are executions that have been carried out to advance a tough on crime perspective in spite of evidence of innocence. And that is very different than the government cutting funding for a life-saving program.
Maybe I'm just cynical, But for me, this goes back to his newspaper articles or adverts about the Central Park Five. I mean, this is who he is. This is who he's always been. He wants people dead. I mean, he said that those people should get the electric chair. And in some states now, they don't even know how to euthanize people. So now they're using firing squads to kill them. I mean, that is a reality of modern America.
Our government kills a lot of people. But again, I'm being very strict with myself here because it's important to our integrity, I think, yes, and to our credibility that we draw really strict lines around the rigorousness of what we attribute to the other side. Certainly Donald Trump, the person, has argued for the killing of innocent people. Central Park 5 case is a great example. Does Donald Trump, the president right now, want to engage in mass murder? I have no idea. I think there is a willingness to let a lot of people die. But as a legal practitioner, I need to differentiate that from what you're describing. And also remain hypersensitive to the direction in which this is moving, if that makes sense.
It is undoubtedly a horrible conversation to have. And I'm grateful to you for your expertise in this moment. But I feel it in my bones, the direction that this country is heading. And I've mapped all of these things from those Instagram reels of hearing the ICE people using this language, watching families being pulled apart, and then hearing the testimony of people who have been sent to countries that they've never known, into jails that are not fit for human purpose. And to me, when you combine that with the study of Project 2025 and this inherent white supremacy and the Great Replacement theory and all of this stuff, these people, I mean, maybe it's not about race and maybe it's more about the rich and the poor. Maybe they just want all of the poor to die, because that's what ultimately is going to happen. The poor people can't pay their way out of a situation. And the fact that a flu jab is not going to be offered or a COVID jab is not going to be offered, the rich can afford to get those things privately and the poor cannot. And if there's a natural disaster, the rich, they get in their private jet at their local airfield and they leave, and the poor are left to drown. Is it more of that than what I was suggesting earlier?
I mean, I think there's a really interesting, the fact that we're talking about followers of Curtis Yarvin here and Peter Thiel.
Yeah.
I think that there's a vision of the future that involves sort of CEO kings of cities that extract labor from an underclass and restrict people's rights. Is that the same as, I mean, what we're talking about is massive oppressive disregard for human life.
Right.
Which is certainly, highly acute in this government. But can we say we've never seen it before when people were left to die in the New Orleans parish jail during Katrina? Can we say we've never seen it before when the conditions in prisons have been what they are for so long? When Brittany Griner was incarcerated in Russia and people were talking about the conditions in Russian prisons, like, oh my God, there's bad food and there's communicable disease and there's rats and there's lack of access to lawyers. I was like, yeah, that's our prisons too, guys. Yes. Like, I think it's important to recognize, to hold both truths, right? That the vision of the future that threads itself through Project 2025 is a vision of massive oppression and extraction of wealth from ordinary people and the increasing of the billionaire class. But at the same time, many of the manifestations of oppression that we're seeing right now have their roots in the practices of this country in recent decades. It's a little bit like when we read The Handmaid's Tale. We're like, my God, this is so shocking. And then you read that nothing in the book is made up. There's a real world example of these practices somewhere in the world that can be found. It's that magic eye moment where you have to recognize that none of this comes out of nowhere. And maybe it's being amalgamated into something highly directed right now. But that doesn't mean it's new.
With Trump's tariffs kicking in over the next few months, there is no plan really to grow the economy. There is no plan to expand employment for people. Cost of living will grow. Inflation is already on the way up. Jobs numbers are coming down. The way he's dealing with that is by firing the statistician, replacing them with a Heritage Foundation official. I mean, this is, you can't make this stuff up, but it's actually happening. And so things will get more desperate, by deporting the food pickers. You're going to have less food on the shelves. I mean, that is what the economists and the political scientists are predicting over the next 6 months to a year to 2 years, because obviously the economy is slow to turn. So what is going to be available to the poorest people of America will be cut significantly. I mean, there's already people living in food deserts, and what little access they have to fresh fruit and vegetables will disappear completely. It's a depressing reality, but that is what's coming. Do you think people are prepared for how Trump's economy is evolving?
No, because people aren't good at stuff that happens slow.
Yeah.
We have to remember that people could see the logic of this from the get-go. The perfect example, if you deport everyone who picks fruit, you're not going to have fruit in the grocery store. But people also underestimate the ability of, say, a particular farm to scramble and to find people for one harvest, just this one time in an emergency, and get the fruit to the shelves. And then over time, the ability of that farm to find workers, to continue to navigate their way out of a labor shortage becomes less and less, and farmers give up and say, you know what, I'm moving into I'm selling this. I don't want to deal with this anymore. That's a slow process. That's not a 6-month process. That's a multi-year process. Also, the role of, say, farm subsidies and propping up industries that are negatively impacted by the tariffs and should be reacting a certain way into the economy. We can see that reaction be blunted by subsidies and other tactics to keep certain sectors afloat. People are not great at understanding that a thing happening in 2027 is because of a thing that happened in 2025. We are not great at that. And in the past, I think when we all engaged more with the media, with news, with long-form journalism, people were better at understanding these longer-term passages of cause and effect. Can we do it now? I don't know. I really don't know. I mean, for example, in the middle of the pandemic, crime was up. Wasn't in the middle, a couple years after 2020, crime was up. And to those of us who study crime over time, I was like, of course, people got really traumatized and desperate and broke. And when people are traumatized and desperate and broke, violent crime spikes. And it's going to go back down when we make people less traumatized and desperate and broke. And indeed it did. But to see the reporting at the time, like even the media had lost the ability to discern how to tell a story over many years instead of over a couple of months. And I really worry about us as a people if we lose our ability to do that.
I want to end on a slightly more positive note, because I appreciate I've taken us to a dark place, and I'm grateful for you coming with me. But, somebody who is talking about policies for Democrats that really could deal with a lot of these issues, from getting access to food and all sorts of things, is Zoran Mamdani, who has, is a mayoral candidate, Democratic mayoral candidate for New York. The media is really maybe scared of him. I mean, the Wall Street Journal had a headline this week: Zoran Mamdani is like a bad therapist. Voters, like patients, often seek comfort rather than insight.
Oy vey.
I know. And I thought that was really unfair. I was thrilled to see his energy, the idea of kind of government-funded grocery stores, and things that are necessary in this moment, especially as we're talking about how food on the shelves could become scarce in some areas, or just outrageously expensive. Is he just ahead of his time?
No. He's right in keeping with his time. I mean, there's a perfect through line from Mayor Scott in Baltimore to the campaign of Zoran Mamdani. I mean, there's a through line from Scott in Baltimore to the work of certain progressive prosecutors who ran around the country using ideas that are based in data, like taking care of people makes us all safer. Not rocket science. The data is there. In fact, the book that I've just written has all of the data in it. That's what it's for, to give people access to this policy information that has a really robust backing in solid research. So no, I think he's right in keeping with the time. And I think what I'm seeing is really interesting because the media is having, being a little bit of a fuss bucket about Zoran Mamdani. But when you talk to prominent Democratic lawmakers behind the scenes, what you hear is certainty that he's going to win. Certainty that he is the future of New York City. Now, obviously, there are real concerns about the feasibility of a lot of his ideas. For example, the bus system is not entirely within the control of the New York mayor. The MTA is a state agency. And it's like really hard to get the government to learn how to run a grocery store. Like there are certainly challenges. I can go down a whole rabbit hole about, it's not a rabbit hole. There are challenges to the implementation of his ideas, but his ideas are emerging from a strong through line of tested policies. For example, free buses. Free buses are something that have been tested in the Midwest. Mayor Wu in Boston did free buses. And in the research on free buses, what we find is thing number one, the number one thing people get arrested for on buses is failing to pay for the bus. When you stop arresting people for failure to pay, because people don't have to pay anymore, you are shaking off the costs of all of that enforcement, all of that police presence, all of the stopping the bus to get the guy off the bus because he didn't pay for the bus, the cost of jailing, the cost of arraignment, the cost of me, the public defender, like all of that is gone. And the volume of arrest is dropping, which is a really great savings for the city and also great for public safety because once again, you reduce these short exposures to jail that can be really detrimental for long-term safety. Then you think about what does it do to the bus system? Well, when you don't have to wait for each person to pay, the buses move faster because people just get on. And then the bus is more often on time. And when the bus is on time more often, more people ride the bus. And when more people ride the bus, there's less traffic in the city. So there's all of these fabulous benefits. The policy itself is a tested, moderate, smart idea. I also think that when we look at his sort of policy proposals and you hear grumpy complaints about feasibility, we also have to understand that what his policies are telling us are what his values are. And his values, again, are the values of the moment. Many people are attracted to Trump because of his false populism. The fact that he says, I'm for ordinary people and I'm going to help you, the little guy. He's not. He's like lighting the economy on fire. But the point is, that's what people are responding to. That's what people respond to in Bernie Sanders, too. That's why people go to Bernie Sanders AOC rallies and why you see these Sanders to Trump crossover voters. Mamdani is speaking to that moment and the fact that as our wealth gap increases in this country and the rich become richer and the poor become poorer and everyday life becomes harder and housing is no longer a thing you can own, but like a subscription service, people are unhappy with that. And so his values tell me that even if he's not talking about like the community violence interruption policy of Mayor Scott, it's likely something he would adopt. It's likely a type of evidence-based, smart, progressive reform that he would engage in. So I think even though the media is having a hard time with it, I think most people in politics understand that Mamdani has a very high likelihood of becoming New York's next mayor. And I think more people need to understand that his ideas are not actually that far-fetched. They're quite practical.
And not radical. This is the other thing I think we need to realize, especially for those of us who've grown up in Europe and, things like healthcare for all are normal and a welfare state system is just normal. They're not considered socialist. They're not considered radical. They are just part of society and society can benefit, as you describe, as a whole, because it's all part of this kind of moving, there are moving parts. You fix one thing, it fixes others. And he certainly gets that. Listen, we have to finish. I could talk about this stuff with you for hours, and I'm so grateful. And I wish you so much success with your book. I know it's out in February, but people can pre-order it now. Do you just want to remind us of where people can get that?
Absolutely. It's called, look at this, I have one. It's called The Price of Mercy. You can get it on my website, emilygalvinalmanza.com, or you can go to your favorite local, independent bookstore. You can order it online. It's on Amazon. Pre-orders obviously matter a lot to whether the book will have reach and whether the kind of information I like to talk about with you will reach a lot of people. So I'm hoping that a bunch of people will choose to pre-order it.
I'm sure they will. Emily Galvin Almanza, thank you for joining the Weekend Show.
Thank you.
I'm Anthony Davis. Don't forget to support me and independent journalism at patreon.com/5Minute News or by joining the 5 Minute News YouTube channel. And I'll come back next Sunday with a brand new special guest and more factual news to discuss on the 5 Minute News Weekend Show with Midas Touch.